And now let's take our Bibles and turn to Matthew 1. You're already there. Beginning at verse 18. Sorry, Matthew 1, beginning at verse 18. Now the birth of Jesus the Messiah took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been engaged to Joseph, but before they lived together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. Her husband Joseph, being a righteous man and unwilling to expose her to public disgrace, planned to dismiss her quietly. But just when he had resolved to do this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, "Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins." All this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. "Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call him Emmanuel," which means God with us. When Joseph awoke from sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him, and he took her as his wife. But they had no marital relations with her. He had no marital relations with her until she had borne a son, and he named him Jesus. We know this story. Matthew tells sort of Joseph's side of the story. Luke tells more of Mary's side of the story. Matthew is sort of the more traditional Jewish gospel. You know what I mean? The audience there for Matthew, it's believed the earliest audience was a very, very Jewish audience, very familiar with what we would call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures. And so you see a lot of quoting of the prophets throughout the Gospel of Matthew. And it's believed the first audience of Matthew's Gospel would have understood that and gone, "Oh, that's from Isaiah," or "That's from Daniel," or "That's from Jeremiah." You know, they would have sort of made that connection. That's from the Psalm. Luke's Gospel, you don't see as many of those technical kind of references. I call it the underdog gospel. You sort of get the stories that would be more difficult to tell in a Jewish setting. And so in Matthew, you have Judaism of that day being a more sort of patriarchal driven kind of group. And so you get Joseph, zooming in on Joseph. Luke is, like I said, the underdog, those who don't really get as much mention. You know, you get the thief on the cross in Luke. You get prodigal son in Luke. You get, and you get a whole lot of things about Mary in the Gospel of Luke, even more so than in Matthew. It's just how they're written and the audience they're written to. So today we look at how God spoke to Joseph in a very uncomfortable and difficult situation and called Joseph to a rugged kind of faithfulness, I call it, to a very tenacious and big time call to trust God above all else. I've often wondered, and maybe you have too, how uncomfortable the first Christmas was. I mean, if we think we've had a big week coming with Christmas preparations, think of Mary and Joseph. I mean, they were on the road. They were by themselves, except for the guiding of God himself. They were moving to a new location, at least temporarily. She was about to have a child. There was a lot of mystery involved in regard to that child, right? There were a lot of promises made by God. There was a lot of trust in God. Honestly, there was a lot of trust in Mary's own word by Joseph and by those around her. So there was a lot of stress. It was not a beautiful Christmas card moment all the time. It was actually a very tough journey to get to the first Christmas. And along the way, it almost was short-circuited by the very Christ child that we celebrate. That child's early appearance as an unborn child, almost messed the whole thing up. And almost just wrecked Christmas from the beginning because of, the kinds of gossip and peer pressure and difficulty that would happen as Mary's pregnancy became more and more evident. And Joseph began to realize this and began to panic and began to struggle, as probably we all would, about how's this going to look and what's this going to be like, and can I really believe this, and is this really true, and maybe I should just sort of, not do anything vengeful or harmful to Mary, but just sort of ease away, disappear from the story, so that, nature can take its course, and I won't be embarrassed, and she won't be embarrassed. I'll just sort of slink away. And it was actually kind of a noble thought for that day. He was saying, I'll just sort of get out of the picture and not cause her any embarrassment, not cause myself or her family any embarrassment. And then God found this creative way to speak. Now, God doesn't always speak through dreams. Sometimes dreams are just crazy. Sometimes dreams are just nutty. Sometimes they're comforting. Sometimes we wake up from a dream and go, okay, that's resolved. Sometimes we wake up and go, what in the world was that? I've had a lot of those, especially lately. Maybe stress induces that. You remember, this is, I probably won't tell in the second service, but you guys know Mark Zinn, the weather guy? I had a dream that Mark Zinn was chasing a black chicken through my house. Which is something Mark would do, but I don't know what the meaning of that was. But anyway, I tried to stop him, and he was like, I've got to catch this chicken. And so I just let him go. Because Mark, is Mark. So I figured, well, that must be normal. Because it's Mark. So it's okay. He'll catch the chicken. He'll be gone. So, but, so sometimes you have dreams like that. And I don't think it means much of anything. I hope not. But anyway. But then there are other dreams where, there seems to be a little more meaning, a little more connection. Well, sometimes, though, especially in the Old and New Testament, the best way that God got people's attention was through speaking to them through a dream. And this is what happened to Joseph. Joseph had a dream, and the dream was so real because it was an angel of the Lord who appeared and said, hey, don't panic over this. You've got to trust me here, God says. I've got this covered. You can be faithful to Mary because she has been faithful to you, and I am going to be faithful to you both. And this son that you will help, bring into the world is my son, who will be the Savior of the world, who's been promised all this time. And one of the great passages in the Gospel of Matthew, in the whole Gospel, is found right here, verse 24. When Joseph awoke from his sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He said, okay. And that's the crossroad that where we all are, I think, at Christmas and every other day, but especially at Christmas. We're at that crossroads all the time where God says, okay, I've told you who you are and what I want and what you're called to be and how you can follow me. Now what are you going to do about it? And Joseph, to his credit, wakes up and says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do what God has said to do. And through that rugged, what I call rugged faithfulness, it doesn't look the same, the way I wish it would. It's not as comfortable as I wish it were. It's odd. Everybody's going to think it's odd. But if God said that it's okay, if God said this is what to do, then I'm going to go do that. This was the act of obedience that God blessed in Joseph's life. So, there's a couple of things I think we can learn from this kind of rugged faith. Now, it must have felt rough. And I think the first thing we learn is this. In order to have that kind of rugged faithfulness, we have to value what God says above what anybody else says. Right? Above all else. It has to be God. And the good news is most of the time, we have enough sort of support around us where if God says something, we get a lot of affirmation. Like God surrounds us with people who says, okay, good job. Thanks for following God. I'm going to trust that God is speaking to you, and I'm going to pray for you. Right? We have a lot of that today. Joseph didn't have a lot of that, but we tend to have a lot of that today, and I'm glad about that. But even when we don't have as much of that as we wish we had, valuing what God says above all else. We have a lot of all else out there, don't we? We have a lot of competing voices. A lot of voices that put pressure on us to act or do a certain thing or say a certain thing or be a certain way. We call it peer pressure with our kids, but peer pressure never goes away. It just kind of gets older. And it matures and it gets smarter sometimes. We have a different, more subtle maybe. I don't know. More subtle is the word. But it's still there. And even above the voices of that peer pressure, we have to say, God, I value your words, your way, above everything else. That's what Joseph did. That's certainly what Mary did. We're going to talk about that a little more next week. But that's what Mary did. Mary's word to God was, when the angel of the Lord came to her about her big announcement, her response was this in Luke: "May it be to me as the Lord commands." What a great, again, it's one of my favorite verses in the Gospel of Luke. May it be to me, whatever God, whatever you say. I know this is odd, and I can give you all kinds of excuses, which he did, as to why this may not work. But at the end of the day, may it be to me as the Lord commands. I heard a Baptist preacher. I don't know why it's funny that he's Baptist, but he just happened to be Baptist. But he was an older Baptist preacher who kind of an old-fashioned revivalist, I remember from my childhood. And I didn't grow up Baptist, but there were Baptists in my family. And he said, "I want to be more like the pig and less like the chicken." And everybody just, gave that look. And I was like, what in the world? He said, "Well, most of you had eggs and bacon for breakfast this morning." He said, "The chicken made a contribution, but the pig was all in." Good Lord. Anyway, I've heard it all. But I think that's what it takes. It takes kind of being more like the pig than the chicken. Like, I'm all in. God, whatever you say, I am fully committed. I am like the bacon. I am all in. I'm not just going to make a contribution like the chicken. I'm all in. And God says, if you'll be all in with me, then through your life, the Messiah will change the world. That's what he said, right? To both of them. Through you, through this faithfulness of these little folks who nobody really knew, they didn't make headlines, I will do something. The Messiah will come to light. Actually come to life, but come to life through you. And it'll change the world. He will save his people from their sin. He will be Emmanuel, which is actually a Hebrew term, God with us. God with us because of this rugged faithfulness. Valuing the opinion of God above all else. Valuing God's way above the easy way. Valuing God's commands and his guidance even above the sort of popular wisdom of the day. Who is God competing with in our lives? That's a great question that I've been wrestling with all week. Who? It's as if God says, who am I competing with in your life? Who am I competing with for first place? Who's my voice competing with? You never been in a crowd and you're trying to hear and there's so many voices and you're like, I'm sorry, I can't hear you. And you have to get a little closer. You have to focus in because all of the distractions, God, I believe, is saying to Joseph, and maybe to us, who am I competing with? What are these noises I'm competing with that are drowning out my voice above the crowd? If it is, maybe get a little closer, right? Draw a little closer. Be all in with me. Commit to my ways above all else. And then finally, follow through. Follow through. Well, boy, if anybody followed through that first Christmas, it was Mary and Joseph. With Mary, to follow through was very uncomfortable and painful. It was uncomfortable for Joseph too, just in a different way. Right? You think about births at Christmas time, I think, because of the birth of Jesus we celebrate and talk a lot about birth and all that. And it brings me back to the birth of my children, of course. And when Jacob was born, it was a difficult delivery. 36 hours of labor, and then they finally had to do a C-section. Things were not great there at first, and he was already kind of we weren't sure, because of some medical issues.
if we were going to be able to have children. The first 5 years of marriage, we didn't have a child, and we prayed, and somehow. But then even after Jacob had come to full term, there was difficulty in the delivery, and we were at the hospital several times the day before he was born, just a lot, and we finally, it was it, and then we're just going, and we went. It was a 13-mile drive to the hospital, and that was the longest 13 miles of my life, I'm sure of my wife's as well. And we get there, and it was like the fourth time we'd been up there that day, because throughout the day, and they kept sending us home, which I thought was weird. And then finally, okay, and it's time, and then hours and hours passed, and then the doctor came in and said, okay, we're going to have to do something different, because every time we try normal delivery, both their blood pressures drop, and we can't have that. It's too dangerous. So we're going to do what's called a C-section. Let me describe it to you. And I'd been up for 36 hours, and I'm not a medical person anyway, and so I could have been spared the description just to do it. But I was already woozy, and they said, okay, so here's the plan now. We're going to put you in scrubs, that's me. We're going to wheel Edna in. You're going to come in with the doctor, and you're going to be there still. This is going to be different. So they brought me in. They sat me down on a little stool, thank the Lord, right beside Edna, and they put this little curtain thing up, thank God. And then they said, okay, Charles, do you want to be down here to watch things happening, or do you want to be up there holding Edna's hand? I said, do you want me on the floor, or do you want me on the bench? That's your choice. Well, we don't need you on the floor, so we're going to put you up there. Great choice, because I'll be on the floor. And so I'm holding her hand, and she's gripping my hand. She's stronger than she looks, man. She's gripping my hand. And the thing about C-sections, that if you don't know, is they're quick. And I'm sitting there waiting for the long haul, and what seemed like about 2 minutes, I'm sure it was longer than that, they went, okay, here's your son. I was like, wow, why didn't we do this 30 hours ago? That would have been great. And Edna still jokes with me about how pale I looked, and how I was like, well, honey, you were great. You were a champ and all that stuff. And she goes, yeah, I kind of had the harder job, I go, I know. It was just, as hard as it was for me, it was tougher for you. But they both had tough jobs on that day, just in a different way, right? And Joseph had a tough job because he had the duration to sort of protect. And he is known, and in fact, certainly in Catholic tradition, in Christian tradition, he is kind of a patron saint of like foster parenting and protector of women kind of thing. That's kind of his role in the history of the church, because he had to spend those months protecting his wife, protecting her reputation, standing with her during what could have been socially very negative, very bad stuff, and probably was. But as tough as his job was, obviously, Mary's was tougher. And what they both were called to do in their own way, in different ways, and this is part of this message, I think, in different ways, they both had to follow through. Right, that's the point. They both had to follow all the way through. They both had to say, I'm in this, God, for the long haul. And in the 4th month and in the 6th month, and when it gets uncomfortable and people start talking, and we have to make some changes, and I have to say some things and defend some things and protect some things. Or for Mary, I have to endure pregnancy and sort of the scorn that may come with that. I'm all in. I'm going to follow through. Once this starts, God, I'm here by your grace. You're going to have to strengthen me. You're going to have to guide me. You're going to have to give me the strength I need. But I'm here all the way. I'm all in. I'm committed, and I'm going to follow through with what you've called me to do. And I think that's sometimes in the church, and I know for me too, where we miss out. Our intentions are good. Our initial sort of awakening or commitment is good. And it's life-changing, and it gets our attention. I've spoken to youth a lot and youth camps and stuff. And there's jokes about youth camp where you get saved every year at youth camp or whatever. And those are lighthearted, but they're also important to address. And I know when I've spoken with youth at youth camps, I've said, look, you commit and recommit as God leads you. No one's going to make fun of you for that, even if you've done it over and over. But here's the thing. One of the key areas that you're going to have to take seriously in your life once you say yes to this initial prompting that you're going to feel in this camp, because you're going to feel, this is a very conducive kind of place, for God to work, right? You got everybody sort of focused on God, focused on worshiping God, focused on hearing from God. You've got your peers with you who are also very excited about hearing from God, most of them. And so you're going to feel prompted to respond, and you're going to feel as comfortable responding to God here than you've ever felt, Good, okay? Good for that. Let that happen. But what really will make this a powerful time is that the day after you leave here, are you still all in? Right? The day you go back to school, in their case, are you still all in? The day you go back to your job, are you still following through with the commitment you make today? That's where God can really do something dynamic in your life. I still believe that, don't you? I believe that for all ages, for my age and yours. I believe that initial response is important. Joseph wakes up and goes, wow, that was from God, and I need to take that seriously. But here's what's more important. He got up and obeyed God and took her as his wife and, walked her through that journey. That is the key, I think, to the kind of faithfulness that God can use to change the world. I think that's the key. So I think, honestly, as a church, he's certainly calling us to wake up and to have that first response, and we need to do that. But I think also he's calling us to say, all right, are you all in? Are you going to follow through with what I've called you to do? Because if you follow through, Mary and Joseph and us, if you follow through, then here's the thing. The Messiah will come, and he will save his people from their sins because of your faithfulness and my faithfulness to you. I think that's what God has called us to do. Well, Christmas takes, finally, Christmas has a lot of connotations. We think of joy, we should, peace, love, hope, all these things, light in darkness, all these things are good. But the more I go back over and over and over again throughout my life, just like you do with this Christmas story, because my whole life I have heard the Christmas story, and I've preached on the Christmas story for, I don't even know, almost 30 years, 29 years maybe. I think over and over again, the word that keeps coming up for me for Christmas is kind of an odd one that's not on Christmas cards. It's courage. I never seen a Christmas card that said courage on the front. They say joy, which is fine. There's those other things are good too, peace and joy, and those are important. Believe me, they are key. But there's one that could be put on a card, I think, courage. Because think of the courage that it took for Mary and Joseph to not only say yes to God in this big adventure, these young people, but then to follow through. Abraham Lincoln, after the Civil War, there was a mom, who tried to get in to see the president. Can you imagine? I don't know if it's even possible to really get in and see the president unless you're famous now. I really don't. No matter who the president is, it's just tough. But back then, a little more accessible, I guess. And she petitioned and sent letters, and finally, over a few days' travel, ended up at the White House in Washington, D.C., and actually got an audience with Abraham Lincoln. And he was a compassionate soul, and he kind of gave in and said, I will see this mother. It turns out she was the mother of a traitor, of a spy, a northern guy who spied for the South and got caught and got arrested and was sentenced at the end of the war. And he did it at the end of the war, which is almost too late, But he was still, though, sentenced to hang. Right? That's what treason usually got you back then. And that's what he was sentenced to do. And he was waiting, like many prisoners, he was waiting to see what would happen. And his mother made a petition to the president to spare his life. She apparently, according to the history book, she didn't know he was a spy. She wasn't in on it. It surprised her like it did everybody else and all that, and she was heartbroken for lots of reasons. But she pled with the president, according to his journal, for the life of her son, and said she was not excusing what he did, but was asking at least that he not be hanged, that he had the opportunity to reform and to realize now that the war is over, blah, 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 right? And she was making a petition for his son. And Lincoln, according to some records, said something like, and she reminded me of my own mother. And so he said, maybe against my better judgment, I sent her away with the satisfaction of knowing her son would not hang. And I sent the order through the commanders, don't hang this guy. Basically, spare his life. Do whatever the tribunal says he needs to serve, which ended up not being life even, but because at the war there was a lot of amnesty given even by Lincoln himself. But don't hang him, basically. And the guy's life was spared. Lincoln, apparently, according to, again, some of the things I've read, went back and wrote something like this. I stewed over that particular one more than any for some reason, because of the lives this young man had caused to be lost. And he says, there were days, I must confess, I wish I could have given him a little bit of hanging. I know, I just thought that phrase stuck out to me. A little bit of hanging. Maybe just a little bit of hanging. Now, what's that have to do with this? Well, I think Mary and Joseph in this story in particular, was kind of experiencing, because I remember reading that phrase going, well, what the heck would that look like? That what would a little bit of hanging look like? Well, maybe what Joseph went through over those next 9 months or so felt like a little bit of hanging. And even though it felt like a little bit of hanging, the Bible says that by God's grace, Joseph followed through and was faithful to what God had called him to do. And when the child was born, he named him Jesus, Yeshua, which is basically God with us, Emmanuel, the Savior, the Messiah, the promised one. He was faithful all the way through, even down to the naming. And God changed the world through that. I think there's a message for us. I think that's the Christmas message for us, really. That's the everyday message for us, but certainly for Christmas. Faithfulness, hearing God's voice above all else, valuing it above all else. And even though there are days when that faithfulness will feel like a little bit of hanging. And there are times, folks, we know that. There are times it's uncomfortable to take a step of faith, right? To stand for our faith, to be faithful in the midst of all these other voices. It feels uncomfortable. It feels like a little bit of hanging sometimes, depending on the circumstance. But when we're able to say, God, I'm all in, I'll follow through. God says, then watch me change the world. Let's stand together.